In this presentation, I'm going to try and get into the quagmire that is NA versus none. This seems to cause a lot of heartburn with people not understanding the appropriate time to use NA versus none. And then when they write a WPS or a PQR and it gets kicked back because they used NA versus using none, they get a little sore and cranky about it. And then you have to explain to them the nuances of writing a weld procedure and why we use none versus NA, and why NA is generally not a good option when writing a WPS or a PQR. So hopefully this will help explain some of it and give you a little insight into NA versus none and what the theory is behind it and what the big deal is. Before we get into this, we need to understand the terminology. WPS is a welding procedure specification. It's qualified instructions on how to complete the weld. It is a recipe card that you give to the welder that tells him how to make the weld. It is how you bake the chocolate chip cookies. How much chocolate chips are required, how much sugar, butter, salt, whatever. How long you cook it for. Those are all things that are written on the WPS. They are the instructions that tell the welder how to complete the weld. The PQR is a procedure qualification record. It's a record of welding parameters and test results. So that is the parameters and the test results that we used the first time we made chocolate chip cookies. The very first time. We put them in the oven for a certain amount of time. It is the recipe that we used. So it is going to be the backup documentation for the WPS. And then we've got a WPQ, which is a welder performance qualification. This is a record of welder test results and ranges of approval. We're not going to get into that today because that's a whole nother animal, but I just wanted to address it here and say that welder qualifications, they do exist, but they are not a part of a WPS and PQR. That's a whole different world. So realize that welder performance qualification paperwork and documentation does exist, but it does not influence the PQR and the WPS. Changes to variables. If a change is made to any essential variable, requalification of the procedure is required. If change is made to a non-essential variable, the procedure need only be revised or amended to address the non-essential variable change. When notch toughness is required by the construction code, the supplementary essential variables become additional essential variables, and a change requires requalification of the procedure. So what's that telling us? That's telling us that if we change something that's a non-essential variable on the WPS, we can change it, and we just have to revise the WPS to reflect that we've changed that variable. If it's an essential variable and we change it, then we have to requalify the weld procedure. This would be something like changing the base metal. Let's say I have a P number. They'll say I have a welding procedure that I'm qualified to weld stainless steel to stainless steel, P8 to P8, but I want to change it so I can weld P8 to P1, which would be stainless steel to carbon steel. Well, then I would have to requalify my procedure. I might use the same filler metal, but I'm using different base metals, so I'm going to have to do an additional PQR to back up that, hey, I can do that with this material. So you need to address these appropriately. I'm going to get into it here in a second and explain, give some examples of what are essential and non-essential variables. Examples of essential variables for gas metal arc welding and flux cord arc welding. Examples of essential variables would be things that if we change the essential variable, it's going to impact the mechanical properties of the weld metal that's being put into the joint. So you have to tread lightly here, and that's why if you change one, you have to do a PQR, another PQR that supports your change. So for shielding gas, if we went from a single constituent gas like pure argon to maybe a mixture that was 75% argon, 25% CO2, we have to requalify. We need to do another PQR that supports that, hey, we changed this gas and we can deposit sound weld metal into the weld joint utilizing this mixture, which is different from our original. Post-weld heat treatment. Let's say we qualify a weld procedure with no post-weld heat treatment, and then we want to use it as, for some reason we're going to need one that needs post-weld heat treatment. Well, if you go either way, if you go from having post-weld heat treatment to no post-weld treatment, or the other way around, you need to requalify. Transfer mode, if we're going from short-circuiting gas metal arc welding, which is, the voltage is, 20 to 20 volts and lower. If we go from that to a spray arc mode, we're going to have to requalify. P number, I used this one before. So if you're going from a P number, let's say we have a procedure that's carbon steel to carbon steel, and then we want to weld carbon steel to stainless steel using the same filler materials, we'd have to requalify the procedure. F number generally comes into play when you're using, F number would come into play here too, because you might have an F number 43. Let's say we had a gas metal arc welding procedure using an F43 filler material, which is a nickel alloy, and we wanted to change and qualify the procedure using a austenitic stainless steel, which would be F number 6. So you've changed F numbers there. You've got to, go back and requalify. Same thing goes for A numbers. A numbers for ferrous materials are the categories of, it tells you the chemistry of the filler material you're using. So if you switch A numbers, if I went from an A number 1 to an A number 6, which would be going from carbon steel to austenitic stainless steel, I would have to change that because my F numbers would be the same. You can have austenitic stainless steel that's an F6 and a carbon steel filler material that's an F6, but the A numbers are going to be different. So if I switch A numbers, I've got to requalify. So hopefully I didn't make this too confusing, but this is just some examples of essential variables for gas metal arc welding and flux core arc welding. If you change these on a WPS, you need to requalify and do another PQR that supports the changes that you made. Examples of non-essential variables for gas metal arc welding and flux core arc welding. Groove design. ASME Section 9, they don't really care about groove design. You need to call it out. You need to address it. But if I qualified with one specific groove design, they don't care if I switch to another. If I had, the angles or, went from a single bevel to a double bevel or whatever, they don't care. Just as long as I address it. I need to address it. But if I change groove designs, it's not affecting the quality, the mechanical properties, or the chemical properties of the weld metal that's being put into that groove design. Backing, same thing. If I use backing or don't use backing, they don't care. I need to address it, but it's not affecting the composition or the mechanical properties of the weld metal that's being deposited in that weld joint. Same with filler metal diameter. If I qualify a weld procedure with 035 carbon steel, hardwire, ER 70S6, and then I want to go to 045 or another size, they don't care. I just need to address it. I need to put it on the WPS and make sure that the welder knows, okay, this is the size of filler metal that I'm using. But it doesn't affect the end product as far as mechanical properties or metallurgical properties or chemical resistance type properties. Same with gas flow rate. I need to address it on the WPS, but it's not a game changer. It doesn't change the mechanical properties. I know I keep restating this over and over, but I'm trying to, beat this into your heads. So same with like for orifice, cup, or nozzle size. Same thing. It's not going to affect the universe and how that weld is put in there, how that weld filler material is put into that weld joint, but you need to address it because you're giving the welder instruction on what needs to be done. So any of these things I can change on a WPS. I just need to revise the WPS. Go from revision 1 to revision 2. Oh, I changed the groove design, or I eliminated backing, or I added backing, or I changed the filler metal diameter that the welders can use. You just change it. It's an editorial change, revise the procedure, and go from there. Whereas if it was an essential variable like on the previous slide, you'd have to go back and requalify another PQR. So these are things you need to keep track of and be cognizant of, some of the subtle nuances of writing WPSs and PQRs. Examples of supplementary essential variables. So these only come into play if your construction code calls out impact testing. These generally aren't important unless impact testing is involved. So you can see we've got position. Generally, position is not a deal breaker. But once you get into impact requirements, then position becomes important because you're going to affect a couple other things while you're doing it. And one of those is our third one on here, which is heat input. Group number also comes into play. If you qualify a procedure without impact testing, you get all of the P numbers. So if I go P8 to P1, P8 is stainless steel, austenitic stainless steel. I would get all of those if I qualified it with no impact testing. And let's say I qualified that to group 1, which is carbon steels. Well, I would get, if there's no impact testing involved, I get everything in group 1 or in P1 to P8. So any stainless steel to any carbon steel that's listed as P8 to P1, I can do those. Well, the minute impact testing comes into play, there's a thing called a group number, which is a further subdivision of the P numbers. The group numbers break down the P numbers into further subdivisions that classify them and into how much impact energy they can take. So then once you start getting into group numbers, you've got significantly fewer materials that you can use to weld to for that particular group number. Heat input. If there's no impact involved, we really don't care about heat input. I mean, we do, but it's not an essential variable. But once impacts come into play, the amount of heat you're putting into the part becomes very important. So you don't overheat it or underheat it. You have a specific window on the heat input. Current and polarity. For the other procedures, for without impact testing, current and polarity don't come into play. You have to address them, but they're not an essential variable. Here, they're an essential variable. So these are just some examples of supplementary essential variables that come into play when impact testing is involved. Once you get into Article 2, Welding Procedure Qualifications, you have QW250, which is welding variables. So this lists the essential and non-essential and supplementary essential variables for each welding process in Section 9. So shielded metal arc welding is not going to have the same essential variables as submerged arc welding or plasma arc welding or gas tungsten arc welding. Essential variables are those in which a change is considered to affect the mechanical properties of the weldment and shall require requalification. Gas metal arc welding, you switch gases. You switch filler metals from, let's say, a carbon steel filler metal to a stainless steel filler metal. That would be switching F numbers and A numbers. Non-essential variables, those in which a change may be made in the WPS without requalification. Like I said before, that would be something like changing the size of the filler metal. You're still using the same filler metal, it's just a different size. And maybe on your initial revision of the WPS, Rev 0, you said, okay, we're only going to use, 332 filler metal. That's it. Well, situation comes up and you want to use 1/8 or 532. You need to rewrite that WPS and include the new sizes of the filler metal to be utilized by the welder. But you don't need to requalify another PQR to support that. You're using the same stuff to weld it together, so you don't need to requalify it. You just need to update your WPS that says, yep, we're going to use these sizes. It's cool. The welders can use these. We're good with it. Supplementary essential variables. This is when notch toughness is required. Supplementary essential variables become essential variables at this point. So if you're doing something that requires notch toughness, then you have supplementary essential variables, and you treat them just like essential variables. These are things, I'm not even going to go into this. I don't have a list in front of me, but these are things like heat input can be one of them. How much thermal energy you're putting into the weld, things like that. So the procedure variables cover all aspects of the weld quality. But just realize that when you're writing your WPS and you're getting ready to do everything, put your PQR together, you need to go into Article 2, which has QW250, the welding variables. You find your specific welding process, and then you just go down the checklist and say, have I addressed this, 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 and this? Overview of ASME Section 9, Welding and Brazing Qualifications. The primary purpose for procedure qualification is to verify the compatibility of materials and techniques to result in sound weld with acceptable properties. The WPS is the instruction to a welder, and the PQR is qualified by mechanical testing and is documentation of mechanical testing. So to qualify a welding procedure, the weld must be destructively tested. You can see I've spiced this slide up with a couple of pictures of, in the middle there's some Sharpie impacts. On the right there's some bend tests. And then on the far left you can see some tensile tests. So these are probably the three biggest, most common tests that you're going to run across when trying to qualify a weld procedure, depending on what you're doing, what the end use of the component is, what the construction codes call out that need to be done. But bottom line is a PQR is going to be destructively tested, and it's going to be documentation of the mechanical properties during that destructive testing. When we're qualifying a weld procedure and it's supporting PQR, the rules come from ASME Section 9 QW 200 General. So if you go to this section of the code and you read out QW 200, each manufacturer and contractor shall prepare written welding procedure specifications that are defined as follows. B. Contents of the WPS. The completed WPS shall describe all the essential, non-essential, and when required, supplementary essential variables for each welding process used in the WPS. These variables are listed in QW 250 through QW 280 and are defined in Article 4, Welding Data. The WPS shall reference the supporting procedure qualification records, PQRs, described in QW 200.2. The manufacturer or contractor may include any other information in the WPS that might be helpful in making a code weldment. So what does this tell us? You go up to the second line of B where it says the completed WPS shall describe all essential, non-essential, and when required, supplementary essential variables. This means you have to address them, whether you think they're a good idea or not, or whether they were even used. You can put none. A lot of times if you don't use post-weld heat treat, you're not using it. it is still required to be addressed, but you just put none. Or if there was something that you didn't do, let's say you didn't clean in between passes, not something that I suggest, but it's perfectly possible that you didn't clean. None, not required. We don't care if the guy cleans in there or not. You can't put NA. You need to put none. Peening is another one that people miss a lot of the time and put NA, not applicable. We didn't do it. Well, if it's not applicable, you need to put none or prohibited. You need to address it in some fashion. Put something in there. NA does not work. You want to use the word none for essential variables that you're not going to use. They're still applicable, but you're just not using them. And you are telling the welder it's important, but this is how we're approaching it. It's prohibited, none, don't do this, do this. You're giving him some direction. So that's a very important concept to grasp in regards to writing WPSs and PQRs, the difference between NA and none. So I'm going to be beating on that dead horse for quite a while through the course of this talk on NA versus none and why we are so, I guess, zealous about how we write WPSs and PQRs. QW 200 General, QW 200.1, we're going to go right into A. A welding procedure specification, a WPS is a written qualified welding procedure prepared to provide direction for making production welds to code requirements. The WPS or other documents may be used to provide direction to the welder or welding operator to assure compliance with code requirements. So you're giving the welder a written document that explains how to make the weld. You're giving him direction. It is like a recipe card. Okay, we're making a pepperoni pizza today. This is how I want it done. I don't want hamburger on there. I don't want anchovies on there. I don't want peppers. I just want pepperoni on there. Pepperoni, cheese, sauce, that's it. You're giving him the recipe card to make that so that he can go out and perform that function. Everything, all the information that he needs to make a code quality weld that is in compliance with the code should be on that WPS. He shouldn't have to go digging in other documents looking for things. It should be on that WPS. And that's what this is telling us, that it's a written qualified welding procedure prepared to provide direction for making production welds. So from QW 200, we have what is required on a PQR. So we have Q100 200.2. Each manufacturer or contractor shall be required to prepare a procedure qualification record, which is defined as follows. Procedure qualification record, PQR. A PQR is a record of the welding data used to weld a test coupon. The PQR is a record of variables recorded during the welding of the test coupon. It also contains the test results of the tested specimens. Recorded variables normally fall within a small range of the actual variables that will be used in production welding. So this is telling us you have to do a PQR, which is going to support your WPS. And this is a record of the welding data used to weld the test coupon. And you need to record all the essential variables that are made during the welding of that test coupon. QW 200.2. Each manufacturer or contractor shall be required to prepare a procedure qualification record, which is defined as follows. Contents of the PQR. The completed PQR shall document all essential and, when required, supplementary essential variables of QW 250 through QW 280 for each welding process used during the welding of the test coupon. Non-essential or other variables used during the welding of the test coupon may be recorded at the manufacturer or contractor's option. All variables, if recorded, shall be the actual variables, including ranges used during the welding of the test coupon. So this is just telling us that if we're doing a PQR, you have to record all the essential variables on the PQR. If you want to go above and beyond the call of duty and you want to address non-essential variables, that's up to you. Sometimes that might be a good idea. So then if you come back later and want to write something, you've got it written down there. But all the variables, if recorded, shall be the actual variables. But you're just recording on the PQR when you're doing a test coupon. You're recording all the variables that were used, all the essential variables that were used in the production of that test coupon. Things like base material, filler metal, was it manual? I don't know if manual is one of them, but shielding gas, purge gas, post-weld heat treat, preheat, things like that can be essential variables. So you need to be cognizant of those, and when you're doing a PQR, you need to record them. The PQR supports the WPS. This one PQR can support one WPS. It's just a supporting document. Like we said, the WPS is a recipe or a work instruction for the welder. Yep, weld it with this many amps, this many volts, this travel speed using this filler metal and this shielding gas. Well, the PQR is the document that supports that, yep, we can deposit sound weld metal into a joint using these variables that are listed on our WPS. And here's our supporting documentation that said we did it once, and we did a bunch of testing that proves that, yes, we can get the tensile strengths, and we've got the required ductility, and we don't have any problems, and there's no defects in the weld. So one PQR can support one WPS. One PQR can support multiple WPSs. This is going to kind of get confusing, and I'm trying not to turn this into Abbott and Costello and who's on first, what's on second. But I worked at a place where we had multiple WPSs that were really, really close to being the same. But the only differences were there were editorial changes, or maybe there were small changes in the size of the filler metal. So let's say customer number one, we're going to use WPS number one to make his component. Well, he only wants us to use 1/8 inch material, 1/8 inch 7018. Customer number two with WPS number two, he's like, I don't care. You can use 1/8 to 3/8. I don't really care. Do what you got to do. So have we changed anything? No. WPS number one just has tighter restrictions, but we haven't changed anything. The essential variables haven't changed. And then let's say WPS number three, he only wants he wants a change on how it's cleaned. He only wants a certain kind of wire brush that's shipped in from Kazakhstan or something like that. Something that is not an essential variable, but it's written in there. So that WPS is different than WPS 2 and WPS 1. But all the essential variables are still supported by PQR number 1. When we did PQR number 1, we didn't have a special Lithuanian or wire brushes sent in from Kazakhstan that were blessed by the Pope. We only had what we got off the shelf. Well, the customer on WPS number 3, he wants his special stuff. So PQR number 1 can still support WPS number 3, but WPS number 3 is different from WPS number 2 and also different from WPS number 1, but they're all three supported because they're using the same essential variables. So I hope I didn't turn this into too much confusion, but that's how one PQR can support multiple WPSs. One WPS can require the support of multiple PQRs. You're asking, how can that be? Well, let's say I've got a whole library of PQRs, previous PQRs that I've done, and customer X wants a WPS written. He comes up and he says, Gary, I need a WPS that I so I can weld the root with flux core, the next pass with shielded metal arc, and the next pass I'm going to use, everything from there on out, I'm going to use submerged arc. And instead of going and qualifying a procedure that does all of those, maybe I've got procedures or procedure qualification records, WPSs laying around that contain all that data. So I go and find the appropriate PQRs, I gather them up, 1, 2, and 3. Yep, this one covers my gas tungsten, this one covers my shielded metal arc, and this one covers my submerged arc welding. So I put all three of those together, I write a WPS, I reference those 3 PQRs, and now I've got a WPS that is supported by 3 separate PQRs. And this can also pertain to post-weld heat treat or any number of essential variables. But a lot of times you'll look at a WPS and you're trying to do some work and not all the essential variables are addressed, so you have to go back and look at the other work and see what you can find. So that's how you can have multiple PQRs supporting one WPS. If Section 9 lists a variable as an essential variable, that variable needs to be recorded on the PQR. Variables recorded need to be actual values. If Section 9 lists a variable as essential or non-essential, the WPS has to address that variable. If a construction code such as B31.3 or ASME Section 1 requires the WPS to be qualified with impact testing, all supplementary essential variables have to be addressed on the PQR and on the WPS as an essential variable. So that's pretty clear cut. Essential variables, you need to address them on the PQR. Even if you don't use them, you qualify a weld procedure without post-weld heat treat, you list it on the PQR as none. Did not perform it. We didn't do it. None. You don't put NA. It is applicable. You record it. You just put none. So then we go from there into the essential and non-essential variables on the WPS that has to be addressed. So you go on to there, on your WPS, you would list all your essential and non-essential variables. And once again, okay, let's say you did a weld procedure and you didn't use post-weld heat treat. You don't list NA if you didn't do it. You list none. N-O-N-E, none. This is one that gets a lot of weld procedures kicked back. If you just remember this, it'll save you a lot of trouble. And if something is NA and you put none, nobody's going to kick it back for that. You're just telling them none. We don't care. So, and then we get to if there's supplementary essential variables, if your construction code, such as B31.1, 31.3, Section 1 or Section 8 calls out that you need impact testing, then there's supplementary essential variables that now become essential variables, and you have to record them on the PQR and the WPS. Okay, here's the code interpretations that back up the NA versus none. Interpretation 98903 addresses, NA versus none. Is it required that all of the essential and non-essential variables listed in QW250 through QW280 for each welding process be addressed in the WPS, even though some of these variables are not applicable? Yes, you have to address them. If you didn't use post-weld heat treat, you have to address it. None, not performed, we didn't do it, we're not going to do it, it's prohibited, whatever. You have to put something in there. You can't leave it blank and you can't just say NA. It is applicable. You need to address it with something other than NA. You can use none, zero, not used, prohibited, whatever. But you can't use NA. Okay, so then there's another interpretation. Interpretation 98303 is omission of an essential, non-essential, or supplementary essential variable from a WPS interpreted to be negative response for that variable. No, the code requires that every variable for the appropriate welding process or processes, QW252 through QW282, be listed on the WPS. That means you have to address it. If you didn't use post-weld heat treat and you leave it blank, that doesn't mean you're saying none. You have to put something in there. None, don't do it, didn't do it, prohibited, however you want to address it. Whatever is appropriate for addressing that to convey to your welder that we're going to either do this or not do this, or it's unimportant. It needs to be written down in a format that is understandable that he can read. NA does not fit the bill for addressing the variable. So this also goes for PQRs. You can't just leave it blank and say, oh, we didn't, not applicable. No, it's applicable. You need to record it. Did you do it? Did you not do it? Whether you did it or not doesn't matter. You just need to record whether you did it or not. You can't leave it blank or use NA. So this leads to a lot of hurt feelings trying to, hash through this. People say, well, we left it blank. That means none in our company. No, it does not. You need to address it. And the code committee has said so right here. So if you have these arguments with people in regards to NA versus none, I usually drop these on them and say, okay, the code, this has been in the code interpretations for the better part of the last 35 years. Here it is. You can't use NA versus using none. You need to address the variable. Leaving it blank doesn't count, and throwing NA in there doesn't count. What not to write on a PQR? If an essential variable is not used during the procedure qualification, do not record the variable as NA. Same thing goes if the essential variable is not used, do not leave the variable as blank. Use none, not used, zero, whatever you need to tell the person that there was nothing done utilizing that variable. So there's a lot of different ways you can get there, but none or not used are probably the two best and clearest forms. Don't use NA. NA is not the same as none. I know I sound like a broken record here, but I'm trying to get this information out because I've run across it so many times. What not to write on the WPS? If an essential variable or a non-essential variable is not used, do not record the variable as NA. Same if a essential or non-essential variable is not used, do not leave the variable blank. NA and blank are not acceptable responses for addressing essential and non-essential variables on a WPS. You need to use words like none, not used, prohibited, not allowed, or something else that is a definitive addressing of that variable. NA doesn't work. So hopefully I didn't get too preachy in this in explaining NA versus none, but I've run across this a lot of times, trying to explain to people why you use none and not NA and the basis of it. And the basis of it goes back 35 or 40 years to, some code cases that came through that said, no, NA is not the equivalent to none. So that's the ruling. So that's the way we go, and that's how we approach it when we're writing weld procedures and PQRs in accordance with ASME Section 9 or even AWSD 1.1. NA is not the same as none. So anyways, take care, and I hope this presentation has been of some use for you, and maybe you can use it in your professional life, and hopefully it's helped you understand a couple of the nuances of writing WPSs and PQRs. Here's my contact information. If you got questions, want to bounce something off me in regards to, hey, how do I do this? What's going on? WPS, PQRs. I also do welding consulting. But anyways, if you have questions in regards to WPSs and PQRs, don't be afraid to lob me an email and ask a question.